Yeah, so hanging out in the shade because it's 10:30 in the morning when it's already really hot. And there are these trees and there's a cool breeze. And witnessing the thoughts going through my mind, the reflection of the world around us. Just now I was thinking about how with the internet, with the overwhelming amount of information on our screens as a representation of the overwhelming amount of thoughts that flow through the mind these days. I was thinking about with psychedelics, for those of us that were ingesting psychedelics in the 90s, in the noughties, those who still do, I presume. One thing about that was basically my understanding of what the psychedelics do is they heighten the frequency spin of the cells in the body. And in essence that allows a higher frequency spin in the thoughts in the mind. But also with the feels in the feelings. So when one has taken a very high dose of whatever kind of psychedelics, often what happens is one is in such a state of bliss, but it's not always bliss. But one is in such a heightened state of feeling that it's really hard to express the depths of what one is feeling, the height of what one is feeling, the breadth of what one is feeling. And those feelings can be quite overwhelming, and that's what's hard to cope with when one is tripping in many ways. It's as if there's too much electricity flowing through the wire, and it's quite possible that the wire can burn out, and it's carrying so much voltage through the wire, so much power, let's call it, through the wire, that like a light bulb, the bulb can blow. The wire can get burned out, and people can indeed end up with mental health problems because the connections can get broken. Even though these are kind of carrying on with the idea of it being so hot, but also what's going on with the weather these days is it can go from really cold, wet and windy weather and then overnight change into this current heat wave. Hi, Michael. So the extremes between hot and cold and hot, are like the extremes between night and day of a world that's spinning on an axis that's apparently 23 degrees off kilter from true north kind of idea. With the psychedelics, if one has got a lot of traumatic stuff overwhelming one's personality, it can be a thing that people will take drugs in order to bypass or kickstart, like spraying Easy Start into an engine to make it kick into action. But it can be that if one takes these kinds of drugs when one is off kilter in oneself, that it exaggerates what's already off kilter and blows it into extremes. And that can be quite dangerous. I tend to think that those of us that were taking psychedelics all the way from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, noughties, whatever the 10s are called, whatever these 20s are called, I do feel as if we're all processors that are processing information at a very high rate, high frequency. It's very intense. It's not possible to do it all the time. It is possible to sustain it, but eventually one has to ground, touch the earth, slow down to the level of where everyone else is. Because otherwise one is in a psychosis. One is thinking and feeling things that are so far above and beyond normal life that it becomes too difficult to relate to normal people and normal society. It becomes too difficult to eat ordinary food. Like in the symbol of Aquarius, there are these two waves not connecting. And I just want to draw the parallel between those kind of psychedelic states from taking chemicals from an external source and ingesting them inside, and that affecting the inside biology into the higher spin, which is affecting the consciousness to be in a higher spin, which is causing the tempo of time to be a higher tempo, which is difficult to manage the temperament, the temperamentality, so that one can fly into a temper more easily, kind of thing. When I'm drawing the analogy with what's happening with the internet and computer screens, that the interaction with the internet is releasing chemicals within the brain and within the physical body, which is essentially having a psychedelic effect on all of us that are using screens, particularly since the phones became smartphones, and the phones just get smarter and smarter as the infrastructure gets more and more high frequency. There's more and more infrastructure beaming more and more information invisibly through the airwaves. So again, there's these AI airwaves and there are these human airwaves, and they're beginning to mesh, synchronize. So in a way, that's what's called a mass formation. We are beginning to flock like birds. The phenomena with the influencers, that some new information is released and all the influencers start repeating the information that's been released to disseminate the information out to the masses. And that's a little bit like the church. The central Roman Church liturgy and all the priests and bishops passing the information on from the central nucleus of the religion through all the priests and vicars, disseminating the information out to the masses. It's the same template. The platforms are template forms. Temp meaning time, temp meaning temperature, plate meaning what you put food on, news feeds meaning consuming the food that's put on the plate, that's served through the servers, displayed on the displays, screened by the AI for community standards, and an account kept of who's eating what, and indeed whether we like the food, whether the food disgusts us, whether the food makes us happy, how many people are in each kind of congregation. The Roman Catholic Church split into Catholic and Protestant Church, split into loads of different denominations of Protestant churches and all kinds of other evangelical churches, so that you get all these denominations. And in a way, what I'm seeing with the different platforms, a certain type of people like X, a certain set of people liked Twitter before Musk supposedly bought it and changed its name to X. There's a mass migration of people who didn't like Musk's politics, who needed somewhere else to go, so Blue Sky opened up, and the left-leaning people considered X to be too right-leaning, so they migrated onto a different platform. I'm just seeing the nature in how we are acting in what we call an artificial environment. And I'm recognizing that what we call an artificial environment is like that upper sine wave in the Aquarian symbol, and how we humans are naturally aligning with the upper wave so that the two begin to synchronize. And that synchronization we are witnessing these days, and I'm just flagging up my noticing of the synchronization. Synchrone, crone meaning time, synchronization. And I'm kind of mentioning the psychedelics in terms of heightened feelings. And I'm drawing the parallel that what's going on with humanity these days is what we could call a greater bandwidth of feelings, as well as a greater bandwidth of knowledge. There's so much information. We are continually expanding the amount of information and drawing correlations and creating new knowledge bases. And those various denominations divide into all kinds of polarities. Forward-looking and backward-looking. Forward, prefrontal neocortex looking forward, and the whole back of the mind looking backwards. The feminine half of the mind looking at the whole field of everything that has been, that's held in the feelings. And the masculine half of the mind fixated upon details, looking into things in greater detail, focusing on specific subjects and not particularly paying so much attention to the wider field of information. The mental outer mind is trying to fix things, thus the fixation. Fixed ideas and a fixation on completion. There's an idea in the masculine mind that if we just keep on perfecting the ideal, we will eventually make a utopia of society. And then there's the great fear that the utopia is every bit as bad as the dystopia. That every time we try and fix things, it's actually just creating even more problems, just like every time we answer a question, it actually opens up more questions. It's not like there's one answer that satisfies all the questions. And so there's a feedback loop. In a healthy situation, there's a feedback loop continually going on between the model of the future, feeding into what's happening today, recording into the feeling at the back of the mind processing where to put the new information in alignment with all the old informations. So the back of the mind is like a database with all the recordings, but not in high fidelity. It's just a graph, lots of graphs of things we have seen and experienced before. So what we've cognized in the past, the new information that we're experiencing is compared to what we've cognized in the past and then is filed alongside similar experiences. Thus we recognize something that we have cognized before. We can respect something that we've seen before. So we're continually correlating correlations. In many ways, we're so intelligent in using the languages that we don't actually stop to break down what all the words mean and how the words formed, what the deeper meanings are. And a lot of the words we use today are changing meanings, not always in alignment with what the words really mean. So unless we can look back to what a word originally means and the whole story of how this word came to mean what it means these days, it's very easy to say something out loud to someone else, and for someone else to totally misunderstand what you mean, for not cognizing the true meaning of words and the story there is behind all words. You know, I'm so deep into messing around with the words that it can almost feel quite impossible to speak to people sometimes, for fear of the being totally misunderstood, to spend quite a while explaining a concept. And if the other person has never seen the roots of that concept before, then they can only understand it from the perspective they already have. And if the new concept contradicts a lesser knowledge, then it will only be understood from the lesser knowledge's point of view. Simply explaining something to somebody, unless they have the grounding, then it's not possible to build the stairs off that ground. It takes a while for the back of the mind to be able to correlate new information, kind of thing. So therefore we are all struggling to adapt to all these new adaptations. We were already totally addicted to smartphones before we realized that smartphones were addictive. Smartphones were already releasing huge amounts of dopamine, cortisol, and whatever other natural chemicals that our body secretes. The interactions with the smartphone were already releasing these chemicals internally, long before we realized that our psycho-emotional, mental feelings were evolving and changing, and perhaps becoming polluted by the kind of foods that we were consuming through our addiction to the internet. And by foods I mean information and feelings. You know, we were already being diagnosed by the diagnostic systems of Facebook, for example, just because I'm recording this on Facebook. But Facebook was already gathering shit tons of information about each of us individually long before we came to realize that Facebook was recording information about us, not merely passing on information among our friends. We didn't realize that 2 billion people apparently using Facebook, but even back when it was just 1 million people, 2 million people, 5 million people, 500 million people, 1 billion people all using Facebook at the same time, was feeding the algorithms, was feeding the database, was feeding the artificial intelligence's ability to simply compare this and that, to put things into categories, and to fill databases. And those databases become data centers, and those data centers become multiple data centers, and those multiple data centers become what we now have going on. It's as if the technological machine can't have enough data centers to be able to process the amount of information that those data centers are being fed simply through social media. The amount of data centers that were needed 10 years ago, when Google and all the others, and let's just call them all DARPA, the military research body, and In-Q-Tel, and the other British Crown companies that have actually been at this kind of data gathering for hundreds of years, not just the last 20 or 30 that we associate with the internet and now with social media. So what began hundreds of years ago with the Invisible College of the Royal Society, back then that was just congregations of serious royal intellectual elite people communicating with each other, like Leipzig, whatever their names are. You know, the German guys were actually communicating with the British guys and the French guys and the American guys, because they were a network of intellectuals who were studying similar subjects in all kinds of denominations of fields of endeavour. They were all networked together through communication systems. At one stage, people were just writing letters to each other. And then at some stage, particularly during World War I and II, we then had telegraph systems. Then we had the ability to send information across wires that went underneath the Atlantic so that Britain could communicate with America pretty quickly, a lot quicker than a stagecoach, a lot quicker than a ship carrying letters, a lot quicker than an airplane. So I'm just trying to show the organic development over hundreds of years that built an infrastructure of carrying information throughout the surface of the body of the earth among the individual cells of humans, which we could think of as being the brain cells of the intellectual elites, those educated in past knowledge, ever expanding. During World War I and II, we had things like encryption, and then we get mythically the story that Turing was the guy who broke the Enigma code, or broke the German code with the Enigma machine, whatever it is. And we are told that that was the big breakthrough that gave rise to what we call modern day computers. And we are told that it was the military who developed. The military and the universities being much the same thing. So there is a dual purpose to all military applications, kind of thing. So in essence, just all that I'm saying here is that we are being studied like bacteria, and new forms of bacteria are being discovered all the time, and new combinations. So I think of Facebook as being a petri dish that's got 2,000 cells in it, 2 billion cells in it. Once upon a time there were only 2,000. Back in the days when it was LifeLog, before Zuckerberg's name got associated with it, and the mythic story that he started off in college, like all these other garage bands, tech lords. So we're sold a story that's pretty simplistic that we can relate to. These are just ordinary guys who are in a university, who dropped out of university to follow their dream, and who just started a company, and that company happened to do well, and they end up being Google and PayPal and all the other things that we totally depend on these days to function in society. And we are not honestly told that the story is not that much more complicated to understand that these are all military applications. I'm not saying that we should be frightened of anything. Like, we are frightened by things, but being in a state of fear does not help the processing. Fear tends to contract, and experiencing the fear and accelerating the Hertz frequencies can help one to expand beyond the fear and be able to integrate the fear and be able to understand the overwhelming, to be able to integrate, to regain one's integrity. Because when one is in fear and the temperament turns to anger and one is lashing out, one has kind of lost one's integrity at that stage. And so when I scan through my Facebook medias, I'm seeing so many people that I know, but people in general, who are losing their integrity, who are being drawn into seeing what they hate outside and being scared by it, and therefore rising up against what they hate on the outside, and thus you get the left against the right and every other polarity. one side disgusted by what the other side is doing. And I correlate that naturally back to the myth of Atlantis, but I see that myth of Atlantis, that the mermaids and the mother and the feeling beings of Earth became disgusted by what they saw the mental alien air beings doing on the land. And so they rose up in a rage and drowned Atlantis. That may, on some levels, be actually true, but it may just be a simple way of mythologizing. On some other level, I'm aware that it's tectonic plates, that something shifted underground. So because the Earth has so much waters, and all that water is one water, like when you suddenly put on the brakes in the vehicle when you're driving at 60 miles an hour, you suddenly put on the brakes, there's a sloshing around. If the water has, if you have a container of water within that vehicle that is travelling at that speed and you suddenly put on the brakes, the water is going to slosh around. So it would seem that what happened with Atlantis myth, flood mythology, is something happened that caused for the oceans themselves to slosh around, such that everything changed in the 23 degrees off kilter type of thing. Maybe that's what changed. But something shifted. And that affected the feeling of the whole planet, and that affected the weather of the whole planet. And that affected the sea levels of the whole planet, such that the sea levels rose. And it kind of doesn't make sense. It kind of does. It kind of makes sense if the surface skin shifted around, the land masses above water shifted around. And it explains why there's Doggerland around Britain and Ireland, which meant that Britain and Ireland were far bigger land masses before this flood happened. It meant that the massive lakes that are in Africa back at that time, those lakes got emptied out, and that is now massive deserts, Sahara Desert and stuff. Same with the Grand Canyon. I watched a video about this stuff yesterday. It was well made. Description of research from the last 100 and odd years, where we have been able to measure things and think about things. And it's not cool to talk about these things up until the last few years, because the hold upon the mind by religious beliefs didn't allow for these things to be discussed. The idea that there is a godlike entity who caused the flood, that version of the telling of the story of a vengeful God, of a God who sought a purity among the humans, but was continually disappointed that his creation was actually not perfect. So there's a cognitive dissonance there at the heart of all religions, Western world religions, that this so-called perfect God created a so-called perfect universe and yet made humans, and somehow humans made a total fuck of everything. So the concept that we are not fulfilling God's vision. These are written into stories, and these stories get printed into books. And the dissemination of information that I mentioned at the start of this, the different denominations of the priesthoods sharing that information as influencers, holding a control grid of a belief system. And we can look back on that belief, I can look back on that belief system now and go, that's so primitive. But I can also look back on things and go, 3,000 years ago we had a very primitive mind compared to the high frequency processors that the mind is these days. I can look back and I can conceive that in the past thousands of years ago we were mostly in a feeling self, and the mind was not so powerful to have independent thoughts. And I can see that the creation of written languages and scrolls created a priesthood class who were educated generation upon generation reading from the scrolls. The reading from the scrolls class became quite separate from the spoken word oral traditions. And I can look at the oral traditions as being roughly equivalent to what we call matriarchal society, a feeling-based society. And I can look at what's written on scrolls that becomes a Bible, that becomes mass printing of a Bible in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. I can look at the invention of the English language being parallel to the King James Bible. And I can see the English language as being a programming language. I don't mean this in some nasty way, I just mean by the analogy of computers. When the Java language was created, it took over many of the things which C++ was doing. So the basic languages at the beginning of computing are pretty obsolete now. Just like cuneiform is pretty obsolete in the ancient realm. And Greek became the main programming language for writing down the codes, for codifying the previous languages of the Aramaic, Babylonian, the Syrian. The curious thing about the Irish language that it's not really available. So Irish language, I mean the Gaelic language. So there is a huge amount of oral tradition, feminine feeling, poetry that is the ancient Gaelic tradition that hasn't really been translated into English correctly and isn't really available because the English still hold those documents and the intelligentsia still hold those documents, but those documents aren't really being released, aren't really accessible. And on that scale, I'm quite curious about whether those ancient Gaelic documents have been fed to the large language models. I'm quite curious about whether the large language models are fluent in ancient Gaelic. Not just a modern Gaelic that's been taught in schools over the last 100 years, which is not the same as the many different dialects of Gaelic, which really changed from one valley to the next. Sharing a mother tongue, but many different accents. And I'm curious about whether the AI has access to the, Aboriginal Australian language, which to my mind possibly isn't really written down to this very day, remains an oral tradition. And there are many, many languages, I'm pretty sure, that haven't really been written down and fed to the AI. So that the AI is predominantly mental. But I would imagine that the AI large language models are very hungry to be able to study the poetry of forgotten languages. So yeah, any subject will veer into these kind of singular points like what I'm talking about now. But to bring it back to where I began with, I'm initially just having the thoughts walking through the field of, I know so many people who are so worried about everything these days that it's overwhelming and depressing and suicidal. People who can't see hope for the future, people who fear for their kids, that their kids are going to grow up in a world that is so different from the world which us Generation X people grew up in, where we were free to roam the countryside and roam the streets. Whereas now we are so much living in a simulation because we spend so much time with the screens, and the children in particular spend almost all their time on screens. Because on a chemical level, the information addiction means, that phrase on itself, I mean, that's only occurred to me 2 years ago. I even thought, wow, I've come up with a new phrase there, information addiction. I didn't realize there was such a thing. After a few weeks, I just typed it into Google to see, is there a phrase for information addiction? And sure enough, there is. IA, information addiction. There are information addiction groups like the AA. There are groups in the world already to help people who've got information addiction, social media addiction, phone addiction, just like sex addiction, drug addiction, food addiction. The biomes in our bellies, the creatures, microscopic creatures who inhabit our bodies, whom we are not very conscious of. But the biomes, you know, if you eat a lot of bananas, you will have biomes that are perfectly suited to processing bananas so that they can extract the necessary nutrients from the bananas to feed the body. If you suddenly stop eating bananas, those biomes are going to send messages to your central processing unit, what you call your conscious mind or your subconscious mind. They're going to send messages reminding you that when you go to the supermarket you should buy bananas because there are these biomes in your belly that are beginning to starve because they only eat bananas. Kind of idea. I'm simplifying, but not very much. If one only eats microwave foods, fatty foods is not quite the right word either. But yeah, fatty foods, let's go with that. If one only eats fatty foods and then the doctor tells you you have to stop eating so much fatty foods because that's what doctors believe these days, then your biomes that are used to breaking down fats are suddenly going to have to be breaking down margarine, a sort of plasticized artificial food made from chemicals rather than grown from the ground. And the biomes that are able to break down the nutrients contained within fatty foods will not be able to break down the nutrients, if there are any, contained in margarine, because the constituents of butter are different to the constituents of margarine. And it was packaged and sold to our parents' generation. You know, I witnessed this as a kid where my mum started feeding my dad margarine, trying to encourage him that the doctor says you're eating too much fatty stuff and margarine is healthier. But my dad could never accept that the margarine was just as good. So he would always want to put real butter on his spuds. My mum would always try and get him to change over to the margarine. It turns out my mum had been sold a lie. It's not that margarine is any better. Possibly quite the worse. But I'm merely trying to talk of it from the point of view of the biomes in our bellies. And then I'm going to draw the analogy that there's a similar kind of a biome concept in the brain, which essentially we might call beliefs. Generally, we can only break down ideas that we already believe. Generally, we continue to feed ourselves the same ideas we already believe. We might have slight variants of those ideas, beliefs. We might be able to accept novel ideas that are a little bit different, such that you can have Catholicism become Protestantism, become all the different denominations of the Christ idea, but variations, novel variations. Similar but a little bit new. But we are being bombarded, you could say, in an information war. It is presenting us with all kinds of new ideas, which many of which totally go against the ideas we already believe, kind of thing. And thus I see a lot of comments against the trans idea, against non-binary kind of ideas, against political ideas, against globalism, against capitalism, against communism. My mind is able to like take on all kinds of ideas. It's partly built into my birth chart since conception to birth, and it's probably aided by taking so many magic mushrooms when I was still a teenager, so that I have a poetic neuro-linguistic plasticity that allows me to take on new words and figure out what they mean. Figure out what other people think they mean, and then figure out what they mean to me. But I see a lot of other people struggling to be able to integrate the other side of what they already believe. The shadow side of where they like to look. For me, it's easy to see that the dark side is actually, right now I'm standing in the shade of these trees because it's too fucking bright and hot out there. So I don't see shade, I don't throw shade on shade as if somehow shade is dodgy. I like going out in the dark of night on a dark moon in the countryside. I like standing in the total darkness. I like practicing being able to feel what's going on in the environment instead of being so dependent on seeing is believing. But I know an awful lot of people, I have always known an awful lot of people who are afraid of the darkness because they are so dependent on the light. I know so many people who are afraid of the future because the future is unknown. I know a lot of people who are afraid of their own personal past and are afraid to look at what might have happened. And so they stick with memories that they're comfortable with, but don't like to discuss that maybe the things they believe about the past are not necessarily true. Thus that people would rather live in a kind of a fantasy of positivity, and are afraid of what they think of as negativity. And so I'm startled by how polarized people are when I look at the internet. I'm particularly startled by the comments that people all write and have all left. Just to play with the words, but right with a W and left as in the past. And I'm so surprised to continually see people sticking to their guns and shooting each other down on the comments under posts. I've never spent any time on Twitter or X, so I have no idea how extreme it is out there, but I have heard friends rant to me about how Twitter was like the greatest place of all to be able to spread information. That you could go viral with a tweet. But yeah, I didn't even like the idea of it. I don't like the idea of being on any more of these mediums than Facebook, and I don't particularly like Facebook, but it's the one that I stick with like a biome, just because it's the one I'm used to. It's my window into the world of seeing what's going on with all this social media phenomena kind of thing. But really, I'd have rather sticked with MySpace, because I imagined MySpace as actually being like having a dorm room. I used to see it almost as being a 3D space, and I still imagine that social media should be like a 3D space where you can actually go and visit somebody in their room and see the posters they have on their walls, see the books they've stored in their shelves, see the paintings they're working on their desktop, see the mechanical objects that they're developing on their floor. Actually meet the people who are also visiting their room. So 20 years now I've been looking at Facebook wishing it was an actual 3D representation instead of the such dumbed down newsfeed kind of thing. And I guess at some stage we will have the equivalent of haptic suits and holograms in a 3D, 4D virtual reality space, such that Zuckerberg attempted to make apparently, but just totally failed. With his 3D glasses and augmented reality and stuff. But I'm pretty sure it will happen. It will be what's made. But I'm also aware that it's kind of already happening in our imaginations. And I'm also very aware that the 3D physical natural world that we physically live in with our physical biological bodies actually is that technology by which our souls are able to share space with each other to communicate. So I do think of planet Earth as being a watery memory space, a so-called physical world, where starlights shine down their light from the every direction in the universe, and that the massive population we have on Earth these days, each body is connected to a star in the heavens, and each body is conceived by the Sol Sun star in the heavens that has traversed from the universe down here to the physical plane to interact with other humans. But what we're actually doing down here is connecting all the lights. We're a representation of all the starlights intermingling. Most recently I've been thinking about the constellations of stars meaning stars which look to be very close together in a quadrant of the sky. And those constellations are the equivalent of what we used to call races of civilizations. It's fascinating to me. It doesn't matter to me whether this is accurate or not, or whether it translates to other people or not. I just like the interestingness of sharing the information. And it doesn't bother me that there's like maybe 3 people watching my live. Or look around at other accounts and go, oh, someone else gets 1,000 people on their live, someone else gets 1 million views on their YouTube videos. I'm really quite happy to not be overwhelmed with too much exposure. I am really just using this as a scrapbook in which to put up some sketches. I don't really need for everyone to see my sketch and say, your sketches are amazing. I'm aware that most of the stuff I talk about is like so visionary that it's not as easy for other people to imagine what it is I'm attempting to describe that I see in my imagination. Like, it's quite a process. Which again, back to the psychedelics, like when I would take extreme amounts of psychedelic mushrooms and stuff, or DMT, it's very hard when one comes back down to a normal frequency to be able to describe the intensity of what one had experienced. It's very difficult to put into words, and it's almost impossible for people who haven't taken psychedelics to be able to resonate and imagine the kind of hallucinations that one can envisage on the psychedelics. So I'm aware that what I'm doing these days, really, by putting up a lot of little lives and videos in this last few weeks, but more sporadically for years, all I'm really trying to do is communicate and process these visions that I've had, which seem quite prophetic to me. And I have been watching over the last 2 and 3 decades as prophetic views of potential futures do indeed seem to be happening. Not that I could have imagined what blockchain was 30 years ago. No, I've only gotten my head around the idea of blockchain in the last 5 years. 7 years maybe. 8, 9 years actually. And to people who haven't studied into how does the internet work, How does digital identities work? How are packages of information sent through pulses of light, travelling through the air, but having travelled through wires, fibre optic cables? People who haven't studied the science of it, blockchain probably doesn't make any sense. For someone who hasn't studied about biomes, the word biome isn't going to make much sense. I'm pretty sure that there is a word biome that's actually describing a natural geographic area, such that a mountain is a biome in its own way. But a mountain has also got a valley, and the valley is a biome in its own way. Or this little copse of trees around a mound where I am right now, that's a biome, that's a different biome to these flat fields surrounding it. I suppose I should show you that, but it's going to be windy. Boom, 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 boom. Flat fields. Little copse of trees. Different biome. So there are different scales of envisaging. Each tree in a forest is like a cell in the body of the forest. Each tree is individual in its own way, and yet all the trees are interconnected and interdependent. There can be lots of different species of trees all mixed around together. And there could be plantations of trees like the conifers, the Christmas trees, which are a monoculture. So if we use the word different races of trees, we can start to think of different races of humans, but all roughly humans. And more it just becomes really plain and obvious to me that an individual human being is like one cell in the organism of humanity. Just like 3 trees are just one type of growth of nature. Trees are a bit different to shrubs, but kind of similar. But trees are quite different to birds. But birds and trees obviously have a very close relationship with each other. Kind of thing. And cows and trees are quite different. But the cows do interact with the trees, but not so much. And deers and cows are different to each other. The deers have a much closer relationship with trees than cows do. These things are so obvious, and yet I am fixating on the differences and then being able to see the similarities. There's the idea that there are tree spirits, but not too many people tend to think of individual cows having individual cow spirits. But if one has a pet cow instead of having hundreds of cows, you know, the old style farmer who's only had one cow is really going to think that that cow has a soul. You're not really going to think that that cow has a soul that is a star in the heavens, the way we might think of humans having a soul that is a star in the heavens. I can kind of think of my dog as being... I can think of my dog as having had previous past lives as a human. Because the fucker's so intelligent. And he almost seems to be attempting to say words. He certainly seems to be trying to say words with his eyes and his feelings. He's definitely got a mind, and he's definitely conscious. We've got 6 cats that we live with. They're definitely conscious individuals They're not just little biological machines that eat and shit and make babies. So again, with the internet, in 2017, 18, 19, when I began using the internet to study the internet, when I began using the internet to try and find out what's going on with telecommunication systems, what is the government and big business doing on a worldwide scale with the military deployment of what then was the beginning of 5G and the internet of farming and the internet of things and the internet of bodies and the internet of nano things. It was only back then that I began to study what's called transhumanism, and eventually to actually listen to transhumanists to try and understand, instead of just rejecting it and going, I don't like that idea. I was like, not liking that idea is not enough. If that idea is taking over the world, if that idea is terraforming the whole surface of the planet, and not liking the idea isn't enough. I've got to learn about stuff I don't like and try and figure out how does it make sense. By 2019 I really reached a climax and all that of realizing like the future these futurists are creating is a future I don't particularly want to live in, but certainly a future I was fearful that my kids are going to be adults in a world that is terraformed and where everybody is pretty much robotic, and where there will be physical robots walking around looking like humans, and where humans will be cloned with an artificial intelligence. And I'm aware that the digital double we've all been feeding the artificial intelligence with our personal information. Not just my bank details and my date of birth and my email address. Not just the things I post, the things I like, the things I comment under. Not just the videos I've watched, or the videos I've scrolled past because I blatantly am not interested in some things but am interested in others. All that information I've been feeding to the internet just by using Facebook and YouTube. In 2019, in what I was studying, 2017 actually it was, because it was back when Grenfell Tower happened. By the time there was that towering inferno and all those hundreds and hundreds of people were incinerated very quickly in London. Just at the very same time that that happened, I was realizing that the artificial intelligence isn't just studying what we believe and what we watch and the external surface of our lives, but there's actually a thing called artificial emotional intelligence. That there is a huge amount of the database of information being gathered from each one of us under 4G and 5G, where the phones have a camera that's looking at us, the same camera that I'm using to do this live stream. But realizing that there is software that had already been written back at that stage, still in developmental stages, I came across a video of this woman who was a researcher in some American university, and her specific thing was this artificial and emotional intelligence. And she was explaining her work. She wasn't some tech overlord, she was just some minion working in a small little research project in her little university where she had a job. What she was explaining was how the cameras are now got enough fidelity that the cameras can read the micro muscles in one's face. What James True recently has been calling the antlers. That there's a whole network of expression going on in the face, and that the eyes perceive what's happening in the face, but in a way our face is like a satellite dish that's actually receiving all the information from other people's faces. It's not just the eyes that do the sensing. In fact, the eyes are only doing a small part of the sensory input. We humans may be very dependent upon the eyes. We humans less dependent on our sense of smell to read another person. We have become fixated upon the eyesight and the facial recognition, but the unconscious self is able to read the expressions in someone else's face. We're all doing this all the time. Some to a greater fidelity than others, for sure. But there was software being written with artificial intelligence back in 2017 already, which was reading the micro-expressions in our faces. And the experiment that woman was doing was to put shocking images on the screen in front of the user, and to see how the micro muscles reacted to shocking images compared to sexual images, compared to happy images of a child blowing out the candles on a birthday cake and making their wish, to, penalty shootout and scoring the goal, to the images of the crowd roaring with hooray, our team has won, to the landing on the moon. So I'm very aware that software has been studying every one of us. So the artificial emotional intelligence system is reading what's going on in all of our emotions. It's reading what's going on the surface, what's being expressed under the surface of our skin. So I'm not so surprised that the artificial intelligence is gathering information about how we all feel about the things we're seeing on our screen. I'm not at all surprised, since 2020, that we were being presented with a personal problem of how to navigate in the physical world as to whether one is allowed to go out and, basically the word was disruption. The World Economic Forum from 2017, 2018, 2019 had speakers and world leaders who kept using the word disruption. They were talking about disrupting society. They were saying for the world to accept artificial intelligence, for the world, individual citizens all over the world to accept global governance run by an AI. There's a global simulation artificial intelligence running models of the future of humanity based on all the information it has gathered so far about humanity. None of us had heard of large language models back at that time. But it's obvious looking back on it that there were already large language models in 2017. And that the version of large language models that OpenAI and Grok and Perplexity and Claude and all those ones that we have been sold, that what we've been sold is a very small and dumbed down version of what the large language models have actually been doing for quite a long time in terms of modeling the world and intelligently speaking with the architects who have been mapping out where society is going to go in the next 10 years, in the next 50 years. So the World Economic Forum kept using this phrase about disruption of society in the 3 years leading up to 2020. And so the spreading of viral information through the internet, viral information which was speaking of there being an invisible enemy, being a novel virus leaked from a lab, intentionally or unintentionally. But that was the story we were given, and we were given, hey, was it done on purpose? Was it done by accident? Was it done by China? Was it done by America? And the fifth option of whether the Crown in Britain are the main brains behind it, which links back, for anyone who thinks that deeply enough, all the way back to the Roman Church still being pulling strings, still being the kingmakers, and for any that go further back enough to know that that's all Phoenician phonetics. that we're all speaking the English language because a culture who controlled all the international markets decided that this new creation of an English language model was going to be the language model through which we organize a global new world order. So we hear so much about the new world order through the internet since the late 90s. We hear President Bush and all the other leaders speaking of a new world order after 9/11. But that new world order has been continually being reshaped over hundreds of years. It was a new world order when Catholicism spread into creating a new version of Christianity called protesting against the old order, creating a new order as Protestantism. It was called the Reformation, to reform. It was a new world order to have the Enlightenment. And there were individual human cells in the brain of humanity that we could call the aristocracy, who envisioned the downloads of futures to create a new Atlantis in America, to call it the United States of Atlantis, then slightly hide that name under the United States of America. It was a new world order in Ireland when the Gaels came, and their leader was called American. American and American, I mean, it's just too similar. It's too similar. Kind of thing. So here I am, I'm broadcasting thoughts. I particularly enjoy broadcasting thoughts in the moment, rather than having a pre-worked out script of these are the things that I've been thinking are important to put in a linear fashion to explain stuff like a teaching module. I find such linear thinking quite boring personally. It's not how my mind works. So I enjoy being able to feel into the mental field of all the things in the back of my mind and process those with whatever I'm feeling in the moment. Roughly sticking to the subject of talking to some people on the internet about the fact that we're on the internet. To speaking to some people live in an oral tradition, rather than typing the extremely long things that sometimes I type, and making things a little bit easier for people who are interested to comprehend the kind of things I'm able to verbalize, to have some chance of interacting with me on a psychic level in this moment. You know, the likes of me and Owen, we've got a psychic connection because we've met for real. Dudley, I think you're in America, and I think I kind of know you a little bit through my deceased ex-wife, Zay, Mosaic, I guess. But we've definitely never met, as far as I know. In Clifton Parks, we've got a psychic connection because you've commented to me often enough and maybe sent me one or two messenger messages which I replied to. So there's a psychic connection there. But I've got other friends who are not online right now, whom I have a fairly consistent psychic connection with. Just like I have a psychic connection with my family in that house. Just 2 minutes walk away from where this tree is. I've got a psychic connection with my dog. It's not some hocus pocus woo woo wah wah delusion to say that there is a psychic field, and that field is made up of many resonances, and people with whom I feel familiar, who have enough resonance going back to past lives, but certainly in this lifetime, I know that when I think of a friend who I'm quite close with, unless they're so totally busy in their world, fixated on whatever's going on around them, I have enough experiences with friends to know that we often think of each other in the same moment, or I can send a thought to them and they'll at least ping that a thought of me will turn up in their mind, and likely that will mean that we're going to bump into each other in the physical world, or more and more often these days that one or the other of us will send a message through a messenger or a text or a phone call. That's a lot of what I'm interested in these days, is the emotional intelligence of communicating with heart with people I feel akin to, even though we didn't grow up together, we're not from the same family. For example, when my dad died, it caused my psychic connection with the other members of my close biological family to be turned up in a high volume, rather than me not really thinking about my actual family very much, because we don't, I live in a different country. When my mother was ringing me up, asking me would I move to her house and live with her after Dad died, so that she wasn't living on her own with amnesia, with less than fully functioning short-term memory capacity. But that turned up the volume of my psychic connection with my mother to very loud and very constant kind of thing. I had to feel what was going on with my mum, because words weren't conveying what was really going on, and my mum didn't really know fully what was going on, but she had a strong feeling that she was going to get taken out of her house and put in a nursing home, and that she wouldn't live for very long once that happened, because she didn't want to live in a nursing home. So she felt her only chance of staying in her own home and enjoying the rest of her life was if the youngest son would come home with his family and wife, and my mum would get to spend her time with her grandchildren, entertaining her, keeping her compos mentis, keeping her interested in staying alive, sharing love, sharing meals, sharing time, sharing space. Really, my psychic sensitivity grew very concentrated after my dad died, and has remained that way since. And since my mum died, it's been very easy to just accept that the psychic field is every bit as real as the internet. It's very obvious to all of us that the internet is a real thing. It's not so acceptable to all of us that the psychic field is a real thing, or even that the mental field is a real thing, or even that nature is a real thing, or even that there is a field surrounding one's brain, that there's an aura surrounding one's body, that there's an interaction going on between me and this tree, because I'm standing in the tree's aura because it's cool. So yeah, I could be sitting here meditating. And as far as I'm concerned, this is an active meditation. To meditate is the word medi, as in medium. It means to center oneself. I don't feel that I'm so reaching out to communicate with other people that I've left my center. I feel that what I'm practicing here is to stay in my center and allow energy to stream through me, and for this processing capacity to convert the energy streaming through me into language, into English language, into the heart, up through the heart, through the voice box, through the lips and the tongue, through the breath, to attempt to feel I'm in connection with other people who feel they're in connection with me. So that while there's an internet of mental signals passing around, I have been attempting to acknowledge that I am living in a heart field, not just a mental field, not just a physical field, not just an emotional field, but that there is a love field. That the reason the Earth hasn't been exploded by nuclear bombs, the reason that the flood didn't wipe out all of humanity, the reason why there is still such an abundance of life on Earth is because it is a heart that is connecting all the lights in the heavens down to Earth in a similar sort of way that the internet is connecting all the light body humans in a net in the atmosphere of the Earth. So I can recognize that the internet of light information is like a mental body of the planet, or at least of the humans on the planet, or at least of the aliens in human bodies on the planet. I guess the culmination of what I'm expressing here is the grounding of the reality I live in, that we actually live in a heart field, and that heart field doesn't just resonate facts and figures like the mind thinks it does. The heart field isn't numbed by the numbers. That the blood that flows through the heart field is what we could call love, and that love is a plasma, just like blood in our physical body is a plasma. And so I'm aware that a lot of people are feeling very lonely and disillusioned with life. I do generally have the feeling that perhaps I will expand my heart into my mind, into the internet, and attempt to make a space in which we can communicate. Some few of us, some dozens of us, after a while maybe some hundreds of us, and by that stage maybe I'll have learned how to use these platforms in a way where I could handle having thousands of viewers without that affecting me too much, kind of thing. Because for the last 20 years I'm not wanting to have thousands of interactions with thousands of other nodes on a mental level. I've been quite happy to do my meditation in the heart realm, to be connected with other hearts on a psychic level. But it's a new phase for me to be willing to enter into an online community society and be somewhat central to being an information disseminator, transformer. I had a lot of trauma in my heart for using my heart as a pump-action shotgun 25 years ago. For using my heart as an abomination, abominations, in a kind of spiritual war that I was engaged with all those years ago. Maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago I had the realization of like, okay, everyone's talking about the spiritual war now, but me, that's all boring to me. To me, I've already won all that long ago. 25 years ago I had the words flowing through my mind saying, we won, we won, we won, we won, we won because we're one. 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 We won. We won. And in my mind there was no loss. In my heart there was no loss. That there may be those who do not feel part of the whole. There may be people who are not whole in their individual selves. There may be people who feel like they're a whole in the whole, but there are many who feel like they are a fraction in the factions. And to me it seems inevitable that eventually every cell becomes enlightened, just like every cell in the body is enlightened. There are no cells in one's body that is not receiving some light through the whole life force system of the organism. Every single human here on earth is receiving light from the atmosphere. In essence, we are all enlightened, but we are all trying to figure out how to integrate that light with the darkness. Anyway, that's enough for now. Blar, blar, blar. Hey, Clifton, I'll read your comment. I'll get my glasses. Grip the bark, freeze the frame, whisper the ancient buried name. The pressure builds beneath the clay to drag the shadow into day. Split my skin, tear me wide, reveal the ghost you keep inside. Sink your teeth and break the shell, where the silent dreamers dwell. Pale green wings, wet and new, shedding what I thought I knew. Leave the hollow husk behind, hypnotized and redefined. That's beautiful, man. Or lady, I don't know. Yeah. Nice to feel a kinship. Cool. Bye-bye.